Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. In the quiet, secluded village of Eldermere, nestled between rolling hills and dense ancient forests, there existed a place of both beauty and mystery, a sprawling garden known as the Garden of Whispers. The garden was unlike any other, its pathways lined with statues so lifelike they seemed to breathe, their stone eyes following visitors as they wandered through the labyrinth of hedges and flowers. The statues depicted people from all walks of life, children playing, lovers embracing, warriors in mid-battle, and elders deep in thought. Each one was a masterpiece, carved with such precision and detail that they appeared almost alive. The garden had been the creation of a reclusive sculptor named Elias Thorne, who had lived in Eldermere over a century ago. Elias was a man of great talent, but also of great sorrow. He had lost his wife and daughter to a tragic illness, and in his grief, he had poured his heart and soul into his work. The Garden of Whispers was his magnum opus, a tribute to the beauty and fragility of life. But there were rumors whispered among the villagers that Elias had imbued the statues with something more, something dark and unnatural. It was said that Elias had made a pact with forces beyond the veil, trading his soul for the ability to bring his creations to life. The statues, according to legend, moved in the dark, their stone limbs creaking as they wandered the garden under the cover of night. Some claim to have seen them shift positions, their expressions changing from serene to sorrowful, from joyful to menacing. Others spoke of hearing whispers in the garden, voices that seemed to come from the statues themselves, their words filled with longing and regret. Over time, the garden fell into disrepair, its pathways overgrown, its statues weathered and cracked. Elias Thorne had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only his creations and the mystery of their origin. The villagers, wary of the garden's eerie reputation, avoided it, and it became a place of solitude and silence, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. But the garden's secrets were not lost to everyone. There were those who were drawn to its beauty and mystery, who could not resist the pull of its enigmatic allure. Among them was a young woman named Lila Hartwell. Lila had come to Eldermere to escape the chaos of the city, seeking solace in the quiet simplicity of village life. She was a writer, her mind always filled with stories and ideas, and she had heard the tales of the Garden of Whispers. Intrigued by the legends, she decided to visit the garden, hoping to find inspiration for her next novel. On a cool autumn evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky was painted in hues of orange and purple, Lila made her way to the garden. The air was crisp, the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth filling her senses. She pushed open the rusted iron gate and stepped inside, her breath catching at the sight before her. The garden was even more beautiful than she had imagined, its overgrown pathways winding through a sea of wildflowers and ivy. The statues stood like silent sentinels, their stone faces illuminated by the soft glow of the setting sun. Lila felt a sense of awe and reverence as she wandered through the garden, her fingers brushing against the cool, rough surfaces of the statues. As night fell and the garden was bathed in moonlight, Lila decided to stay, captivated by the serene beauty of the place. She found a bench beneath a towering oak tree and sat down, her notebook in hand, ready to capture the essence of the garden in words. But as the hours passed and the moon rose higher in the sky, she began to notice something strange. At first it was subtle, a faint creaking sound, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. Then she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. She turned her head, her heart pounding, and saw one of the statues, A young girl holding a bouquet of flowers shifts slightly, its head tilting as if to look at her. Lila's breath caught in her throat, and she froze, her mind racing. "It's just your imagination," she whispered to herself, trying to calm her nerves. But as she watched, the statue moved again, its stone fingers tightening around the bouquet. Lila's eyes widened in disbelief, and she stood up, her notebook falling to the ground. The garden was no longer silent. The air was filled with whispers, soft and indistinct, like the murmurs of a distant crowd. Lila turned in a slow circle, her heart pounding as she realized that the statues were moving, their stone limbs creaking as they shifted and turned, their eyes following her every move. Panic surged through her, and she stumbled backward, her foot catching on a root. She fell to the ground, her hands scraping against the rough stone pathway. When she looked up, she saw that the statues were no longer in their original positions. They had moved closer, their expressions no longer serene, but filled with a strange, almost hungry intensity. Lila scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. She had to get out of the garden, but the pathways seemed to twist and turn in on themselves, the statues blocking her way at every turn. She ran, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps, the whispers growing louder and more insistent. As she rounded a corner, she came face to face with a statue of a man, his arms outstretched as if to embrace her. She tried to dodge around him, but his stone hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with a grip that was impossibly strong. Lila screamed, her voice echoing through the garden, but there was no one to hear her. The statue's face was inches from hers, its stone eyes filled with a strange, almost human sadness. "Help us," it whispered, its voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Free us." Lila's mind reeled. The statues were alive, or at least they were something more than stone. They were trapped, their souls bound to the garden, their movements limited to the darkness of night. She realized that Elias Thorne's pact had not just given life to his creations, it had trapped the souls of the dead within them, their spirits unable to move on. The other statues began to close in, their whispers growing louder, more desperate. Lila felt a surge of determination. She had to find a way to break the curse, to free the souls trapped within the garden. But how? As the statues closed in around her, Lila noticed something, a small weathered plaque at the base of the oak tree. It was inscribed with words barely legible in the moonlight. "To break the chain, the heart must speak. To free the souls, the bond must break." Lila's mind raced. The heart must speak. What did that mean? She thought of Elias Thorne, of his grief and his love for his family. Perhaps the key to breaking the curse lay in his heart, in the emotions that had driven him to create the garden. With the statues closing in, Lila closed her eyes and focused, pouring all of her emotions into her words. "I understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I understand your pain, your longing, but you don't have to be trapped anymore. You can be free." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the garden was filled with a blinding light, and the statues began to crumble, their stone forms dissolving into dust. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and then suddenly they stopped. The garden was silent once more. Lila opened her eyes and found herself alone, the statues gone, the garden bathed in the soft glow of the moon. She felt a sense of peace, a feeling that the souls trapped within the garden had finally been freed. As she made her way back to the village, Lila knew that she would never forget the Garden of Whispers. It had been a place of both beauty and horror, a reminder of the power of love and grief, and the lengths to which people would go to hold on to what they had lost. And though the garden was now empty, its statues gone, Lila knew that their story would live on, in her words, in her memories, and in the whispers that still lingered in the night. Deep within the mist-shrouded moors of Blackthorn Hollow, where the wind carried whispers of forgotten tales and the fog clung to the earth like a shroud, there stood an inn that was both a sanctuary and a prison. Known as the Eternal Rest Inn, it was a place of eerie beauty, its timbered facade weathered by time, its windows glowing with a warm, inviting light that belied the darkness within. The inn had stood for centuries, a relic of a bygone era, its existence known only to those who had lost their way in the moors or who had been drawn to it by some unseen force. The inn was run by a man named Silas Greaves, a figure as enigmatic as the inn itself. Silas was tall and gaunt, his face pale and lined with the weight of years, his eyes deep and hollow, as if they had seen too much. He was a gracious host, always ready with a warm smile and a kind word, but there was something about him that made the guests uneasy, something they couldn't quite put their finger on. Perhaps it was the way he seemed to appear out of nowhere, his footsteps silent on the creaking wooden floors, or the way his shadow seemed to stretch longer than it should, twisting and writhing in the flickering candlelight. The Eternal Rest Inn was a place of refuge for travelers caught in the moor's treacherous storms, its doors always open to those in need. But there was a rule unspoken yet understood by all who entered. Once you crossed the threshold, you could never leave. The inn was a trap, a phantom realm where time stood still and the outside world faded into a distant memory. Guests would arrive, seeking shelter from the storm, only to find themselves ensnared in the inn's endless night, their lives suspended in a perpetual twilight. The inn's guests were a motley assortment of souls from different eras, each one drawn to the inn by fate or misfortune. There was Eleanor, a Victorian-era governess who had vanished on her way to a new posting. Thomas, a World War I soldier who had become separated from his unit in the fog. And Margaret, a 1920s flapper who had disappeared on the eve of her wedding. They were joined by others, a medieval minstrel, a Renaissance scholar, a Puritan preacher, all of them trapped in the inn, their lives frozen in the moments they had entered. The inn itself was a labyrinth of corridors and rooms, each one filled with the trappings of the era its occupant had come from. The parlor was a cozy haven of overstuffed armchairs and crackling fires, the dining room a grand hall with a long, polished table laden with food that never seemed to run out. The guest rooms were each uniquely decorated, their walls adorned with portraits and tapestries that seemed to watch the occupants with knowing eyes. But despite the inn's comforts, there was an undercurrent of unease, a sense that something was not quite right. The guests were aware of their predicament, though they rarely spoke of it. They knew that the inn was a place of no return, that the outside world was forever beyond their reach. But they also knew that Silas Greaves was the key to their imprisonment, that he was the one who held the power to keep them there. They had tried to leave, of course, but the inn's doors and windows were always locked, the key forever out of reach. And when they tried to confront Silas, he would simply smile and say, "You are my guests, and I cannot let you go. The moors are dangerous, and you are safe here." But safety was a relative concept in the Eternal Rest Inn. The guests were not physically harmed, but they were haunted by their own memories and regrets, their minds trapped in a loop of their past lives. Eleanor would often find herself back in the carriage, the storm raging outside, her heart pounding with fear. Thomas would relive the moment he had lost his comrades in the fog, his guilt a heavy weight on his chest. And Margaret would dream of her wedding day, the joy and anticipation turning to despair as she realized she would never see her fiancé again. The inn's true nature was revealed to a new guest one stormy night. Her name was Clara, a modern-day journalist who had been investigating the legends of Blackthorn Hollow. She had heard the stories of the Eternal Rest Inn, of the travelers who had vanished without a trace, and she had come to uncover the truth. But as she stepped through the inn's doors, she felt a chill run down her spine, a sense of foreboding that she couldn't shake. Silas greeted her with his usual warmth, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Welcome, Clara," he said, his voice smooth and soothing. You are safe here. The storm outside is fierce, but you need not fear it. Clara nodded, her journalist's instincts on high alert. She took in the inn's interior, noting the anachronistic decor, the way the other guests seemed to blend into the background, their eyes hollow and distant. She tried to engage them in conversation, but they were reluctant to speak, their words guarded and cryptic. As the night wore on, Clara began to notice strange things. The way the portraits on the walls seemed to follow her with their eyes. The way the shadows in the corners seemed to move when she wasn't looking. She heard whispers in the halls, voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. And then, as she passed a mirror, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A reflection that wasn't her own, a face that was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. Clara's heart pounded as she realized the truth. The inn was not just a place of no return. It was a place where the living and the dead coexisted, where the boundaries between the two were blurred. The guests were not just trapped. They were caught between life and death, their souls bound to the inn by Silas Greaves's dark magic. Determined to uncover the inn's secrets, Clara began to explore, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. She found a hidden door behind a tapestry, its lock rusted and ancient. With a sense of dread, she pushed it open and found herself in a dark, musty room filled with dusty tomes and strange artifacts. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it rested a black, leather-bound book. Clara opened the book, her hands trembling, and began to read. The pages were filled with spells and incantations, with diagrams and symbols that made her head spin. But as she read, she began to understand. The inn was a prison, a place where Silas Greaves had trapped the souls of the dead, using their energy to sustain his own immortality. The guests were not just travelers, they were sacrifices, their lives forfeit to keep Silas alive. Clara's mind raced. She had to find a way to break the spell, to free the souls trapped in the inn. But how? The book was filled with dark magic, its pages filled with warnings and curses. She knew that she couldn't do it alone. She returned to the parlor where the other guests were gathered, their faces pale and drawn. I know the truth, she said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. I know why we're here and I know how to break the curse, but I need your help. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, their eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. They had been trapped for so long, their spirits broken by the endless night. But Clara's determination sparked something in them, a glimmer of the courage they had once possessed. Together they devised a plan. They would confront Silas Greaves, using the knowledge Clara had gained from the book to weaken his hold on the inn. It was a dangerous gamble, but they had nothing left to lose. As the storm raged outside, the guests gathered in the dining hall, their eyes fixed on the door as Silas entered, his smile as cold and empty as ever. What is this? He asked, his voice smooth and mocking. A rebellion? Clara stepped forward, the black book in her hands. We know what you've done, Silas, she said, her voice strong and clear. We know how you've trapped us here, how you've used our lives to sustain your own, but it ends tonight. Silas's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing as he realized what they were planning. You cannot break the spell, he said, his voice low and dangerous. The inn is bound to me, and I am bound to it. You are my guests, and you will never leave. But Clara was undeterred. She began to read from the book, her voice rising above the storm as she recited the incantation. The other guests joined in, their voices blending together in a chorus of defiance. The air grew thick with energy, the walls of the inn trembling as the spell began to unravel. Silas's face twisted in rage, his form flickering like a dying flame. No! He screamed, his voice echoing through the halls. You cannot do this! But it was too late. The spell was broken. The inn's hold on its guests shattered. The walls began to crumble. the windows shattering as the storm outside raged with renewed fury. The guests felt a surge of energy, a sense of freedom they had not known in years. As the inn collapsed around them, Clara and the other guests found themselves standing in the moors, the storm still raging, but the inn nowhere to be seen. They were free, their souls no longer bound to the phantom realm. But as they looked around, they realized that Silas Greaves was gone, his form dissolved into the mist. The eternal rest inn had vanished, its existence erased from the world. But Clara knew that the inn's legacy would live on, a cautionary tale of the dangers of greed and the power of the human spirit. And as the storm began to subside, the guests felt a sense of peace, a feeling that they had finally found the rest they had been seeking. They were no longer trapped in the endless night. They were free to move on, to find their place in the world beyond the moors. But as Clara walked away from the ruins of the inn, she couldn't shake the feeling that the eternal rest inn was still out there, waiting for its next guests. Its doors always open to those who had lost their way. And she knew that the story of the Phantom Inn would continue, a tale of endless night and the souls who had found their way to freedom. In the remote, snow-covered village of Frostville, nestled deep within the icy embrace of the northern wastes, there existed a mystery that had baffled the villagers for generations. It was a mystery that began with a trail of footsteps that appeared overnight in the freshly fallen snow, leading from the edge of the village into the vast, uncharted wilderness beyond. The footsteps were human in shape, their imprint crisp and clear, but they were unlike any the villagers had ever seen. They were impossibly large, each step spanning several feet, and they were spaced so far apart that no ordinary person could have made them. The trail of footsteps was first discovered by a young shepherd named Eric, who had been tending his flock on the outskirts of the village. He had followed the footsteps out of curiosity, his breath visible in the frigid air as he trudged through the snow. But the further he went, the more uneasy he became. The footsteps seemed to lead nowhere, winding through the frozen landscape in a meandering path that defied logic. They passed over frozen rivers, up steep cliffs, and through dense forests, always maintaining their impossible stride. Eric followed the footsteps for hours, his curiosity giving way to a growing sense of dread. The landscape around him grew increasingly desolate, the trees becoming gnarled and twisted, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder, the wind howling with a voice that seemed almost human. And then, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the footsteps stopped, not at a destination, but in the middle of an open field, as if the person who had made them had simply vanished into thin air. Eric returned to the village that night, his face pale and his hands trembling. He told the villagers what he had seen, but they dismissed his story as the ramblings of a frightened boy. The footsteps, they said, were nothing more than a trick of the wind, a natural phenomenon that could be explained by the shifting snow. But the footsteps returned the next night, and the night after that. Each morning, the villagers would wake to find a new trail leading from the edge of the village into the wilderness, always ending in the same inexplicable way. The villagers began to grow uneasy, their fear mounting with each new trail. They posted guards at the village perimeter, but the footsteps always appeared, no matter how vigilant the watch. They tried to follow the footsteps, but no one could match their impossible stride. And those who tried too hard often returned with stories of strange lights in the sky and voices whispering in the wind. As the days turned into weeks, the footsteps became a source of both fascination and terror for the villagers. They began to weave stories around them, tales of giants and spirits, of lost travelers and ancient curses. Some believed that the footsteps were a sign from the gods, a warning of some impending doom. Others thought they were the work of a malevolent force, a creature that stalked the frozen wastes, waiting to claim its next victim. Among the villagers was a woman named Alara, a scholar and historian who had come to Frostvale to study its ancient legends. Ilara was fascinated by the footsteps, seeing in them a mystery that begged to be solved. She spent her days poring over old texts and maps, searching for any clue that might explain their origin. But the more she learned, the more she realized that the footsteps were unlike anything recorded in the village's history. Determined to uncover the truth, Ilara decided to follow the footsteps herself. She prepared for the journey carefully, packing supplies and warm clothing, and set out one morning as the sun rose over the snow-covered hills. The villagers watched her go with a mixture of admiration and fear, knowing that she was venturing into the unknown. Ilara followed the footsteps for hours, her breath visible in the cold air as she trudged through the snow. The landscape around her was eerily silent, the only sound the crunch of her boots on the frozen ground. She passed through dense forests and over frozen rivers, the footsteps always leading her onward. But as the day wore on, she began to notice something strange. The footsteps were changing. They were no longer crisp and clear, but blurred and distorted, as if they were being erased by some unseen force. Ilara pressed on, her determination unwavering. She knew that she was close to the truth, that the answers she sought lay just beyond the next hill. But as she crested the rise, she stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding in her chest. Before her was a vast open plain, its surface covered in a thick layer of snow. But it was not the plain that caught her attention. It was the figure standing in the distance. It was tall and humanoid, its form shrouded in a cloak of shadows. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and its breath came in ragged, icy gasps. Ilara felt a chill run down her spine as the figure turned to face her, its gaze piercing through her like a knife. The figure raised a hand, pointing to the ground at its feet. Ilara followed its gesture and saw that the footsteps ended there, their imprint crisp and clear. But as she watched, the footsteps began to fade, disappearing into the snow as if they had never been there. Ilara's mind raced. She realized that the figure was the source of the footsteps, that it had been walking through the village night after night, leaving its mark on the snow. But why? What was it trying to tell her? The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. Ilara felt a surge of fear, but she stood her ground, her eyes locked on the figure's glowing gaze. And then, in a voice that was both ancient and timeless, the figure spoke. "I am the Wanderer," it said, its voice echoing in the stillness. "I am the one who walks between worlds, who treads the paths that others cannot see. The footsteps are my mark, a sign of my presence, but they are also a warning of the dangers that lie beyond the veil." Ilara's breath caught in her throat. "What dangers?" she asked, her voice trembling. The Wanderer's gaze grew distant, as if it were looking into a world that Ilara could not see. "There are forces at work in this world, forces that seek to break the barriers between life and death, between the seen and the unseen. The footsteps are a sign of their presence, a sign that the veil is thinning. If it breaks, the consequences will be dire." Ilara felt a chill run through her. She realized that the footsteps were not just a mystery, they were a harbinger of something far greater, something that threatened not just Frostvale, but the entire world. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Wanderer's gaze returned to her, its eyes filled with a strange, almost human sadness. "You must be vigilant," it said. "You must watch for the signs, and you must be ready to act when the time comes. The footsteps are just the beginning. The true danger lies ahead." And with that, the Wanderer turned and walked away, its form dissolving into the shadows as it disappeared into the snow. Ilara stood there for a long time, her mind racing with the implications of what she had just learned. She knew that she had to return to the village, to warn the others of what was to come. But as she turned to leave, she noticed something strange. The footsteps were gone, erased from the snow as if they had never been there. The landscape around her was pristine, untouched by any sign of the wanderer's passage. Ilara returned to the village that night, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had seen. She told the villagers of her encounter with the wanderer, of the warning it had given, but they were skeptical, their fear of the unknown outweighing their trust in her words. Ilara knew that she had to find a way to convince them, to prepare them for the dangers that lay ahead. But as the days turned into weeks and the footsteps failed to reappear, the villagers began to forget, their fear fading into the background of their daily lives. But Ilara did not forget. She knew that the wanderer's warning was real, that the footsteps were just the beginning of something far greater. And as she watched the snow fall outside her window, she felt a sense of unease, a feeling that the true danger was still out there, waiting to reveal itself. And so the footsteps of nowhere remained a mystery, a trail that led to nothing and everything at once. They were a sign of the unseen, a reminder that there are forces in this world that defy explanation, and that sometimes the greatest mysteries are the ones that lead us into the unknown. In the heart of a sun-drenched valley surrounded by rolling hills and fields of golden wheat, there lay a town unlike any other. Its name was Lumara, a place where the sun always seemed to shine a little brighter, where the days were long and the nights were short. But Lumara was not known for its beauty or its bountiful harvests. It was known for something far more peculiar. In Lumara, shadows did not exist. The phenomenon was first noticed by a traveling merchant named Jonas, who had stopped in the town to sell his wares. As he walked through the streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't until he passed a group of children playing in the square that he realized what it was. The children cast no shadows. No matter how they moved or where they stood, their forms remained unmarked by the dark silhouettes that should have followed them. Jonas mentioned his observation to the townsfolk, expecting them to be as puzzled as he was, but they simply smiled and shrugged, as if the absence of shadows was the most natural thing in the world. "We've always been like this," one of them said. "It's just the way things are in Lumara." But Jonas couldn't shake the feeling that there was something strange about the town. He decided to stay for a few days, hoping to uncover the truth behind the missing shadows. What he discovered was a mystery that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Lumara was a town of light, its streets bathed in a perpetual golden glow. The sun seemed to linger longer in the sky, its rays casting no shadows as they touched the ground. The townsfolk went about their daily lives with a sense of contentment, their faces always lit by an inner radiance. But there was an undercurrent of unease, a sense that something was not quite right. Jonas began to notice small details that others might have overlooked. The townsfolk never spoke of the past. Their conversations always focused on the present or the future. They avoided the subject of shadows, their smiles faltering whenever the topic was broached. And then there were the mirrors. Every house in Lumara had at least one, but they were always covered with cloth or turned to face the wall. One evening, as Jonas sat in the town's tavern, he struck up a conversation with an elderly man named Elias. Elias was one of the few townsfolk who seemed willing to talk about the past, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and fear. "You've noticed, haven't you?" Elias said, his voice low and trembling. "The shadows, they're gone, and with them, a part of us." Jonas leaned in, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" "What happened to the shadows?" Elias hesitated, his gaze darting around the room as if he feared being overheard. "It started many years ago," he said. "There was a man, a stranger who came to Lumara. He claimed to be a magician, a master of light and shadow. He performed tricks for the townsfolk, making shadows dance and disappear. But there was something dark about him, something that made people uneasy." Elias paused, his hands trembling as he reached for his drink. One night, he gathered the townsfolk in the square and performed his greatest trick. He said he could make the shadows disappear forever, that he could free us from the darkness that haunted our lives. We were foolish, so eager for a life without fear that we agreed. He cast a spell, and the shadows vanished, but it came at a cost. Jonas felt a chill run down his spine. What cost? Elias's eyes filled with tears. Our memories, he said, our past. Without our shadows, we lost a part of ourselves. We can't remember who we were before the shadows disappeared. We can't remember our families, our friends, our lives. We are trapped in this endless light, our souls bound to the town. Jonas's mind raced. He realized that the absence of shadows was not just a physical phenomenon, it was a spiritual one. The townsfolk had lost a part of their identity, their connection to their past, and the mirrors. They were a reminder of what they had lost, a reflection of the emptiness within. Determined to uncover the truth, Jonas decided to visit the town's library, hoping to find some record of the stranger and his spell. But the library was empty, its shelves lined with blank books and empty pages. It was as if the town's history had been erased, its memories swallowed by the light. As Jonas wandered through the town, he began to notice other strange things. The flowers in the gardens were always in bloom, their colors unnaturally vibrant. The animals in the fields were eerily silent, their eyes blank and unseeing. And then there were the children. They never aged, their laughter echoing through the streets like a haunting melody. Jonas realized that Lumara was not just a town without shadows. It was a town trapped in time, its inhabitants frozen in a moment of eternal light. The spell that had banished the shadows had also halted the passage of time, leaving the townsfolk in a state of perpetual stasis. But Jonas knew that there had to be a way to break the spell, to restore the shadows and free the townsfolk from their endless light. He began to search for clues, his footsteps echoing in the empty streets. He found a hidden door in the basement of the tavern, its surface covered in strange symbols. With a sense of dread, he pushed it open and found himself in a dark, musty room. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it rested a small black box. Jonas opened the box and found a single silver key. He knew that the key was the key to breaking the spell, to restoring the shadows and freeing the townsfolk from their endless light. But as he reached for the key, he felt a surge of energy, a force that seemed to push him back. The room was filled with a blinding light, and Jonas felt himself being pulled into the shadows, his form dissolving into the darkness. When he opened his eyes, he found himself standing in the town square, the key clutched in his hand. The townsfolk were gathered around him, their eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. Jonas knew that he had to act quickly before the spell could reclaim him. He raised the key high above his head and spoke the words that Elias had whispered to him in the tavern. By the power of light and shadow, I break the spell that binds this town. Let the shadows return, and with them, the memories of the past. As the words left his lips, the key began to glow, its light piercing through the darkness. The townsfolk watched in awe as the shadows returned, their forms once again marked by the dark silhouettes that had been missing for so long. The mirrors in the houses shattered, their reflections restored to their true forms. But as the shadows returned, so did the memories. The townsfolk began to remember their past, their families, their friends. They remembered the stranger who had cast the spell and the price they had paid for a life without shadows. Jonas felt a sense of relief as he watched the townsfolk embrace their memories, their faces filled with a mixture of joy and sorrow. He knew that the spell had been broken, that the town of Lumara was finally free. But as he turned to leave, he noticed something strange. The shadows were not just returning to the townsfolk, they were returning to the town itself, the buildings and streets once again marked by the dark silhouettes that had been missing for so long. And then, as the sun began to set, Jonas saw something that made his blood run cold. The shadows were moving, their forms twisting and writhing as if they had a life of their own. They began to converge on the town square, their dark forms merging into a single towering figure. It was the stranger, the magician who had cast the spell so many years ago. Jonas felt a surge of fear as the figure stepped forward, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "You have broken the spell," it said, its voice a low, menacing rumble. "But the shadows are mine, and I will not let them go." Jonas knew that he had to act quickly before the stranger could reclaim the shadows and plunge the town back into eternal light. He raised the key once more, his voice strong and clear. "By the power of light and shadow, I banish you from this town. Let the shadows remain, and with them, the memories of the past." As the words left his lips, the key began to glow once more, its light piercing through the darkness. The stranger's form began to dissolve, its shadowy figure fading into the night. And then, with a final burst of light, it was gone. The townsfolk watched in awe as the shadows returned to their true forms, their faces filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. They knew that the spell had been broken, that the town of Lumara was finally free. But as Jonas turned to leave, he noticed something strange. The shadows were not just returning to the townsfolk, they were returning to the town itself, the buildings and streets once again marked by the dark silhouettes that had been missing for so long. And then, as the sun began to set, Jonas saw something that made his blood run cold. The shadows were moving, their forms twisting and writhing as if they had a life of their own. They began to converge on the town square, their dark forms merging into a single towering figure. It was the stranger, the magician who had cast the spell so many years ago. Jonas felt a surge of fear as the figure stepped forward, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "You have broken the spell," it said, its voice a low, menacing rumble. "But the shadows are mine, and I will not let them go." Jonas knew that he had to act quickly before the stranger could reclaim the shadows and plunge the town back into eternal light. He raised the key once more, his voice strong and clear. "By the power of light and shadow, I banish you from this town. Let the shadows remain, and with them, the memories of the past." As the words left his lips, the key began to glow once more, its light piercing through the darkness. The stranger's form began to dissolve, its shadowy figure fading into the night. And then, with a final burst of light, it was gone. The townsfolk watched in awe as the shadows returned to their true forms, their faces filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. They knew that the spell had been broken, that the town of Lumara was finally free. But as Jonas turned to leave, he felt a sense of unease. He knew that the stranger was gone, but he also knew that the shadows were not just a part of the town, they were a part of its soul. And as he walked away from Lumara, he couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were watching him, their dark forms twisting and writhing in the corners of his vision. And so, the town of Lumara remained a place of light and shadow, its inhabitants free to live their lives in the balance between the two. But the mystery of the missing shadows would always linger, a reminder of the power of light and darkness, and the delicate balance that lies between them. In the vast expanse of the cerulean ocean, where the waves stretched endlessly to the horizon and the sky met the sea in a seamless embrace, there existed a legend that had haunted sailors for centuries. It was the legend of the Eclipse Mariner, a ghost ship that appeared only during eclipses, its tattered sails billowing in the phantom wind, its hull glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. The ship was said to be crewed by the damned, souls trapped between life and death, doomed to sail the seas for eternity. Those who saw the Eclipse Mariner were said to be cursed, their fates intertwined with the ship's spectral crew. The legend had its roots in the small coastal village of Moonshade, a place where the tides dictated the rhythm of life and the moon held sway over the hearts of its people. The villagers spoke of the Eclipse Mariner in hushed tones, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and reverence. They claimed that the ship was the remnant of a tragic event that had occurred centuries ago, when a powerful sorcerer had cursed a merchant vessel and its crew, binding them to the sea during the moments when the moon devoured the sun. The story began with a young sailor named Kale, who had grown up in Moonshade listening to the tales of the eclipsed mariner. Unlike the other villagers, Cal was not afraid of the ghost ship. He was fascinated by it, drawn to the mystery and the danger it represented. He spent his days studying the stars and the tides, learning the patterns of the eclipses, and dreaming of the day he would see the eclipsed mariner for himself. Cale's opportunity came one fateful summer, when a total solar eclipse was predicted to pass over the Cerulean Ocean. The villagers prepared for the event with a mixture of excitement and dread, knowing that the eclipsed mariner might appear. Kyle, however, saw it as his chance to uncover the truth behind the legend. On the morning of the eclipse, Kyle set out in his small fishing boat, the Starlight, determined to find the ghost ship. The sea was calm, the sky clear, and the air filled with a sense of anticipation. As the moon began to pass in front of the sun, casting the world into an eerie twilight, Kale felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that the eclipsed mariner was near. And then he saw it. The eclipsed mariner emerged from the shadows, its form shimmering like a mirage. Its sails were tattered and gray, its hull covered in barnacles and seaweed, as if it had risen from the depths of the ocean. The ship moved silently through the water, its presence both mesmerizing and terrifying. Kyle's heart pounded as he steered the Starlight closer, his eyes fixed on the ghost ship. He could see figures moving on the deck, their forms faint and translucent. They were the crew of the eclipsed mariner, their faces filled with sorrow and despair. As Kale approached, the ship seemed to notice him. The figures on the deck turned to look at him, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. One of them, a tall man with a captain's hat and a long flowing coat, stepped forward and raised a hand, signaling for Kale to come aboard. Kale hesitated, his mind racing. He knew that stepping onto the eclipsed mariner was dangerous, that it might mean never returning to the world of the living, but his curiosity was too strong, his desire to uncover the truth too great. He tied the Starlight to the ghost ship and climbed aboard. The deck of the eclipsed mariner was cold and damp, the air filled with the scent of salt and decay. The crew watched Kale with hollow eyes, their expressions unreadable. The captain approached him, his voice a low, echoing rumble. "You have come seeking answers," the captain said, "but be warned, the truth may be more than you can bear." Kale nodded, his heart pounding. "I want to know the story of this ship," he said. "I want to know why you are cursed." The captain's gaze grew distant, as if he were looking into a past that Kale could not see. "We were once a proud merchant crew," he said. "Our ship, the eclipsed mariner, was the fastest and strongest in the Cerulean Ocean. But we were arrogant, believing ourselves invincible. One day we crossed paths with a sorcerer, a man who had been wronged by our captain. In his anger, he cursed us, binding our souls to the ship and condemning us to sail the seas for eternity. We can only appear during eclipses, when the veil between worlds is thin." Cal felt a surge of sympathy for the crew, their plight a reminder of the dangers of hubris. "Is there no way to break the curse?" he asked. The captain's eyes filled with a mixture of hope and despair. "The curse can only be broken by one who is willing to take the place of the captain," he said. "But to do so is to accept eternal damnation, to become one of the cursed." Kale's mind raced. He knew that breaking the curse would mean sacrificing himself, but he also knew that the crew deserved to be free. He thought of the villagers of Moonshade, of the fear and reverence they held for the eclipsed mariner. He thought of the stories he had grown up with, of the mystery and danger that had drawn him to the sea. And then he made his decision. "I will take your place," Kale said, his voice steady. I will break the curse." The captain's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, there was silence. Then he nodded, his expression filled with gratitude. "You are brave, young sailor," he said. "But know this, once the curse is broken, you will be bound to the Eclipse Mariner for eternity. There is no turning back." Cal took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "I understand," he said. "I am ready." The captain stepped forward and placed a hand on Cal's shoulder, his touch cold and heavy. As he did, the crew began to fade, their forms dissolving into the air. The curse was breaking, their souls finally free. But as the crew disappeared, Cal felt a surge of energy, a force that seemed to pull him into the ship. The deck beneath his feet began to change, the wood growing older and more weathered. The sails, once tattered and gray, became whole and white, billowing in a phantom wind. Cal realized that he was becoming the new captain of the Eclipse Mariner, his soul bound to the ship. As the eclipse ended and the sun returned to the sky, the Eclipse Mariner began to fade, its form dissolving into the shadows. Cal watched as the world around him grew dim, the sea and the sky merging into a single, endless expanse. He knew that he was no longer part of the world of the living, that he had become a part of the legend he had once sought to uncover. But as the Eclipse Mariner sailed into the twilight, Cal felt a sense of peace. He had broken the curse, freeing the crew from their eternal torment. And though he was now bound to the ship, he knew that his sacrifice had not been in vain. The legend of the Eclipse Mariner lived on, a tale of courage and sacrifice, of the power of the human spirit to overcome even the darkest of curses. And though the ship only appeared during eclipses, its presence was a reminder of the delicate balance between light and darkness, and the choices that define us. And so, the Eclipse Mariner sailed on, its new captain at the helm, a ghost ship bound to the seas for eternity. But in the hearts of those who heard its story, it was more than just a legend. It was a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always a chance for redemption. In the heart of the bustling city of Veridon, where the streets were always alive with the hum of activity and the air was thick with the scent of street food and exhaust fumes, there existed a small, unassuming antique shop tucked away in a narrow alley. The shop, known as Eldritch Relics, was a place of mystery and intrigue, its windows filled with an eclectic array of curiosities, ancient books, strange trinkets, and artifacts from distant lands. The shop's owner, an elderly man named Mr. Alaric, was a figure of equal mystery, his eyes always gleaming with a knowing light, as if he held secrets too vast to be spoken. Among the many oddities in the shop, there was one item that stood out, though it was often overlooked by casual browsers. It was a mask, crafted from a material that seemed to shift and change under the light, its surface a swirling blend of shadows and smoke. The mask was simple in design, with no ornate carvings or embellishments, yet it exuded an aura of power, a sense of something ancient and otherworldly. A small faded tag hung from it, bearing the words, "The Mask of Shadows, beware the price of invisibility." The mask had been in the shop for as long as anyone could remember, its origins unknown. Mr. Alaric would often tell curious customers that it was a relic from a forgotten civilization, a tool used by shamans to communicate with the spirit world. But he would always caution them against trying it on, his voice low and serious. "The mask grants its wearer the ability to become invisible to the living," he would say, "but such power comes at a cost. Once you put it on, you may never be able to take it off." Most people dismissed his warnings as mere theatrics, the ramblings of an old man trying to add mystique to his wares. But there were a few who were drawn to the mask, their curiosity piqued by the promise of invisibility. Among them was a young man named Daniel Harper. Daniel was a struggling artist, his days spent working a mundane office job to make ends meet, his nights devoted to his true passion, painting. But despite his talent, he had yet to achieve the recognition he craved. He felt invisible in the crowded city, his voice drowned out by the noise of a world that seemed to have no place for him. When he first saw the Mask of Shadows in Eldritch Relics, something about it called to him, a whisper in the back of his mind that he couldn't ignore. One evening, after a particularly discouraging day at work, Daniel found himself standing outside the shop, the mask's tag clutched in his hand. He had purchased it on a whim, drawn by the promise of escape, of becoming unseen in a world that had always overlooked him. Mr. Alaric had tried to dissuade him, his eyes filled with a strange sadness. But Daniel had insisted, handing over the money with a determined smile. Now standing in the dim light of his small apartment, Daniel held the mask in his hands, its surface cool to the touch. He hesitated for a moment, the old man's warnings echoing in his mind. But the desire to disappear, to escape the weight of his failures, was too strong. With a deep breath, he lifted the mask to his face and put it on. At first, nothing happened. The mask fit snugly against his skin, its material strangely comforting. Then slowly he began to feel a change. The air around him seemed to grow colder, the sounds of the city outside fading into a distant hum. He looked down at his hands and gasped. They were fading, becoming translucent, as if he were turning into a ghost. Panic surged through him, and he reached up to remove the mask, but his fingers passed through it as if it were made of smoke. "No!" he cried, his voice echoing strangely in the empty room. He stumbled to the mirror, his heart pounding, and stared at his reflection, or rather, the lack of it. The mask was there, its shadowy surface covering his face, but the rest of him was gone, invisible to the world. For a moment, Daniel stood frozen, his mind racing. Then a strange sense of calm washed over him. He was invisible. No one could see him. No one could judge him. He was free. A smile spread across his face, hidden beneath the mask, and he stepped out into the night, eager to explore his newfound power. At first, the experience was exhilarating. Daniel wandered the streets, unseen and unheard, observing the world from a new perspective. He watched people going about their lives, their faces filled with emotions he could now see clearly: joy, sadness, anger, love. He felt like a ghost, a silent observer in a world that had once felt so overwhelming. But as the days turned into weeks, the novelty began to wear off. Daniel realized that being invisible came with a price he hadn't anticipated. He couldn't interact with the world in the same way. When he tried to pick up objects, his hands passed through them as if they were made of air. He couldn't eat, couldn't drink, couldn't feel the warmth of the sun on his skin. He was trapped in a liminal space, neither fully alive nor fully dead. Worse still, he began to notice that the living world was slowly fading from his perception. The colors grew duller, the sounds more distant. It was as if he were being pulled further and further away from reality into a shadowy realm that existed just beyond the edges of the living world. He tried to remove the mask again and again, but it was no use. It had become a part of him, its power binding him to this strange half-existence. Desperate for answers, Daniel returned to Eldritch Relics, hoping that Mr. Alaric could help him. But when he entered the shop, the old man didn't seem to notice him. Daniel called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. But Mr. Alaric continued to dust the shelves, his movements slow and deliberate. It was as if Daniel no longer existed to him. Defeated, Daniel left the shop and wandered the city, his invisible form drifting through the crowds. He watched as people laughed, cried, and lived their lives, their presence a painful reminder of what he had lost. He realized now that the masked power was a curse, a trap that had ensnared him in a world of shadows and silence. As the days passed, Daniel's connection to the living world grew weaker. The city around him became a blur of muted colors and distant sounds. and he felt himself being drawn deeper into the shadowy realm. He began to see other figures there, faint and ghostly, their faces obscured by masks similar to his own. They moved through the shadows like wraiths, their presence a silent testament to the mask's curse. Daniel realized that he was not the first to fall victim to the mask of shadows. The figures he saw were others who had been lured by its promise of invisibility, only to find themselves trapped in this liminal space, their souls bound to the mask for eternity. He tried to speak to them, to find some way to break the curse, but they were as insubstantial as he was, their voices lost in the void. In time, Daniel's memories of his former life began to fade, replaced by the endless monotony of the shadowy realm. He forgot the sound of his own voice, the feel of his own skin. He became one with the mask, his identity swallowed by its darkness. And though he still wandered the city, unseen and unheard, he was no longer Daniel Harper. He was a shadow, a ghost, a whisper in the wind. The mask of shadows remained in eldritch relics, its surface gleaming with an eerie light. Mr. Alaric would often gaze at it, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. He knew the mask's power, knew the fate that awaited those who wore it, but he also knew that he could not destroy it, for it was a relic of a forgotten time, a reminder of the dangers that lurked in the shadows. And so the mask waited, its power undiminished, its curse unbroken. It called to those who felt invisible, who longed to escape the world and its burdens. But for those who answered its call, there was no return. They became shadows, lost in a realm between life and death, their souls bound to the mask for eternity. In the end, the mask of shadows was not a gift, but a trap, a reminder that the desire to disappear comes at a cost too great to bear. And though its power was great, its true horror lay in the silence it brought, the emptiness it left behind. For those who wore it, there was no escape, no redemption. They were lost, forever unseen, forever unheard, forever trapped in the shadows. In the quiet, forgotten town of Eldridge, nestled deep within a valley surrounded by dense, ancient forests, there stood an old, dilapidated mansion known as Blackthorn Manor. The mansion had been abandoned for over a century, its once grand facade now crumbling under the weight of time and neglect. Locals whispered tales of its dark history, of a family that had vanished without a trace, of strange lights flickering in the windows at night, and of a cursed object that was said to reside within its walls. That object was a mirror, an ornate full-length mirror with a frame carved from blackened oak, adorned with intricate, swirling patterns that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. The mirror had been brought to Blackthorn Manor in the late 1800s by the family patriarch, Victor Blackthorn, a wealthy and eccentric collector of rare artifacts. He had acquired it during one of his many travels abroad, though the details of its origins were shrouded in mystery. Some said it had been crafted by a reclusive artisan in the mountains of Eastern Europe, while others claimed it was a relic from a long-lost civilization. Whatever its true history, the mirror quickly became the centerpiece of the manor's grand hall, its surface gleaming with an almost otherworldly sheen. But not long after the mirror's arrival, strange things began to happen. Servants reported seeing shadowy figures moving within its depths, figures that did not belong to the reflection of the room. Victor's wife, Eleanor, claimed to have seen a woman in Victorian dress staring back at her, her eyes filled with sorrow. Their children, too, began to speak of seeing people in the mirror, people who were not there when they turned to look. The family grew increasingly uneasy, and Victor eventually ordered the mirror to be covered with a heavy cloth, hoping to put an end to the unsettling occurrences. But the mirror's influence could not be so easily contained. One by one, the Blackthorn family members began to disappear. First, it was Eleanor, who vanished one night without a trace. Then the children, who were never seen again. Victor, driven to madness by grief and fear, locked himself in the manor, refusing to leave. When the townsfolk finally mustered the courage to investigate, they found the mansion empty, its halls echoing with an eerie silence. The mirror, however, remained, its surface as pristine as ever, as if untouched by the passage of time. For decades, the mirror sat undisturbed in the decaying manor, its secrets hidden behind layers of dust and cobwebs. But as the years passed, the stories of the haunted mirror began to fade, becoming little more than a local legend, a tale told to frighten children on dark nights. That is, until a young woman named Clara Hastings arrived in Eldridge. Clara was a historian, specializing in the preservation of historical artifacts. She had come to Eldridge to document the town's history and to explore the ruins of Blackthorn Manor, which had recently been purchased by a developer with plans to restore it. Clara had heard the stories of the haunted mirror, of course, but she dismissed them as mere superstition. To her, the mirror was a fascinating piece of history, a relic of a bygone era that deserved to be studied and preserved. On a crisp autumn morning, Clara made her way to Blackthorn Manor, her footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves that littered the overgrown path. The mansion loomed before her, its windows dark and lifeless, its walls covered in ivy. She pushed open the creaking front door and stepped inside, her breath visible in the cold, musty air. The grand hall was just as she had imagined it, ornate but decaying, with peeling wallpaper and a chandelier hanging precariously from the ceiling. And there, at the far end of the room, stood the mirror. Clara approached it slowly, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and unease. The mirror was even more beautiful than she had anticipated, its frame a masterpiece of craftsmanship, its surface still remarkably clear despite the years of neglect. She reached out to touch it, her fingers brushing against the cool glass. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, as if in response to her touch, the mirror's surface rippled like water, and Clara stumbled back in shock. When she looked again, the reflection of the room was gone. In its place was a scene from another time, a grand ballroom filled with people in Victorian attire, their faces frozen in expressions of joy and laughter. Clara blinked, convinced she was imagining things, but the image remained. She stepped closer, her eyes wide with wonder, and as she did, the figures in the mirror seemed to notice her. They turned to look at her, their eyes filled with curiosity, and one of them, a woman in a flowing gown, stepped forward, her lips moving as if to speak. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She could hear faint whispers, though the words were indistinct, as if coming from a great distance. The woman in the mirror reached out, her hand pressing against the glass, and Clara felt an inexplicable urge to do the same. She raised her hand, her fingers trembling, and as they touched the mirror's surface, a jolt of energy surged through her, pulling her forward. The world around her blurred, and for a moment, she felt as though she were falling. When her vision cleared, she found herself standing in the ballroom, surrounded by the people she had seen in the mirror. They were no longer silent. Their voices filled the air, a cacophony of laughter and conversation. The woman in the gown stood before her, her expression one of both surprise and relief. "Welcome," the woman said, her voice soft but clear. "We have been waiting for you." Clara's mind raced. She had no idea how she had come to be here, in this place that seemed to exist outside of time. The woman introduced herself as Eleanor Blackthorn, and as Clara listened to her story, she began to piece together the truth. The mirror was not just a reflection of another time. It was a gateway, a portal that connected the present to the past. The Blackthorn family had not vanished. They had been trapped within the mirror, their souls bound to its magic. Eleanor explained that the mirror had been cursed by its creator, a man who had sought to preserve the souls of his loved ones after their deaths. But the curse had gone awry, trapping not only the dead but also the living, creating a liminal space where time had no meaning. The blackthorns had been its first victims, but over the years others had been drawn into its depths, their reflections captured forever. Clara realized that she, too, was now trapped. The mirror had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many others. But unlike the blackthorns, who had resigned themselves to their fate, Clara was determined to find a way out. She spent what felt like days, or perhaps weeks, exploring the mirror's world, searching for a way to break the curse. She spoke to the other trapped souls, learning their stories and uncovering the mirror's secrets. Finally, she discovered the truth. The mirror's curse could only be broken by someone from the outside, someone who could see the mirror for what it truly was, and who had the strength to resist its pull. Clara knew that she could not do it alone, but she also knew that she could not stay. With a heavy heart, she bid farewell to Eleanor and the others, promising to find a way to free them. As she focused her thoughts on the present, on the world she had left behind, the ballroom began to fade, and Clara felt herself being pulled back through the mirror. She emerged in the grand hall of Blackthorn Manor, her body trembling with exhaustion. The mirror's surface was still once more, its reflections ordinary and unchanging. Clara knew that she had been given a second chance, but she also knew that her work was far from over. The mirror's curse still loomed, a threat to anyone who dared to gaze into its depths. She vowed to uncover the mirror's origins, to find a way to break the curse and free the souls trapped within. And as she left Blackthorn Manor, the mirror watched her go, its surface shimmering with a faint, otherworldly light, as if it knew that its secrets were not yet safe. From that day forward, Clara dedicated her life to studying the mirror and others like it, traveling the world in search of answers. She became a renowned expert on cursed artifacts, though she never spoke of her own experience within the mirror. And though she never returned to Blackthorn Manor, she often found herself thinking of Eleanor and the others, their faces forever etched in her memory. The haunted mirror remained in the manor, its secrets hidden behind its gleaming surface, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to gaze into its depths. And though Clara had escaped, she knew that the mirror's curse was far from broken. Somewhere in another time, the ballroom still stood, its inhabitants trapped in an endless dance, their reflections waiting to be freed. It was a rainy afternoon when Eleanor first saw the doll. She had been wandering through the narrow, winding streets of Blackthorn, a quaint village nestled deep in the English countryside. The village was known for its antique shops, each one a treasure trove of forgotten relics and curiosities. Eleanor, an avid collector of oddities, couldn't resist the allure of these shops. She had a particular fondness for dolls. The older and more peculiar, the better. The shop that caught her eye was tucked away in a shadowy corner of the village, its windows fogged with age and its sign barely legible. Blackthorn Antiques and Curios. The bell above the door jingled softly as she stepped inside, the scent of dust and old wood filling her nostrils. The shop was dimly lit, its shelves crammed with an assortment of objects: porcelain figurines, tarnished silverware, yellowed books, and, of course, dolls. It was the doll in the corner that drew her attention. It sat on a high shelf, its glassy eyes staring straight ahead. The doll was about 2 feet tall, with porcelain skin that had yellowed with age. Its hair was a cascade of dark curls, and it wore a tattered dress of faded blue silk. But what struck Eleanor most was its expression. The doll's lips were curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile, as if it knew something she didn't. "Ah, I see you found her," came a voice from behind her. Eleanor turned to see an elderly man with a stooped posture and a pair of thick spectacles perched on his nose. He was the shopkeeper, and his eyes twinkled with a strange intensity as he looked at the doll. "She's fascinating," Eleanor said, unable to tear her gaze away from the doll. "How old is she?" "Oh, she's quite old," the shopkeeper replied, his voice low and measured. "Early 19th century, if I'm not mistaken. She's been in this shop for as long as I can remember, waiting for the right person to take her home." Eleanor felt a shiver run down her spine, but she couldn't explain why. There was something about the doll that called to her, something she couldn't resist. "How much is she?" she asked. The shopkeeper hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "For you, my dear, she's free. But I must warn you, this doll is not like the others. She has a history." Eleanor frowned. "What kind of history?" The shopkeeper's expression darkened. "Let's just say she's been known to whisper things, secrets, things that should never be spoken aloud. Some say she's cursed. Others say she's a vessel for something far more sinister." Eleanor laughed nervously. "You're just trying to scare me, aren't you?" The shopkeeper's eyes bore into hers. "Take her if you wish, but remember, you've been warned." Despite the shopkeeper's ominous words, Eleanor couldn't resist. She took the doll home, carefully wrapping it in a cloth and placing it in her bag. As she left the shop, she thought she heard the faintest whisper, but when she turned around, the shopkeeper was gone and the door was closed. That night, Eleanor placed the doll on a shelf in her study next to her other collectibles. She sat at her desk, sipping tea and reading a book, when she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound was coming from the doll. "Eleanor," the voice whispered, so faint it could have been her imagination. But it wasn't. The voice was real, and it was coming from the doll. She stood up, her hands trembling, and approached the doll. Its glassy eyes seemed to follow her as she drew closer. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The doll's lips didn't move, but the voice came again, louder this time. "I know your secrets, Eleanor. I know what you've done." Eleanor stumbled back, her mind racing. What was happening? Was she losing her mind? She grabbed the doll and shoved it into a drawer, slamming it shut. But even through the woods, she could hear the whispers, faint and insidious. The next few days were a blur. The whispers grew louder, more persistent. They spoke of things Eleanor had buried deep in her past, things she had never told anyone, secrets she had sworn to take to her grave. The doll knew them all. "You lied to him," the doll whispered one night, its voice echoing in the darkness. "You told him you loved him, but you didn't. You just wanted his money." Eleanor clutched her pillow, tears streaming down her face. "Stop it," she begged. "Please, just stop." But the doll didn't stop. It whispered of the time she had betrayed her best friend, spreading rumors that ruined her reputation. It whispered of the lies she had told to get ahead in her career, the people she had hurt along the way. It whispered of the darkest corners of her soul, things she had tried to forget. Desperate for relief, Eleanor returned to the antique shop, but it was gone. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. She asked the villagers about the shopkeeper, but no one knew who she was talking about. It was as if the shop had never existed. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They began to invade her dreams, turning them into nightmares. She saw herself as a child, standing in a dark room, the doll in her hands. But it wasn't her. It was someone else. Someone with her face, but not her soul. The doll whispered to that other Eleanor, and she listened, her eyes wide with fear. One night, Eleanor couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed the doll and threw it into the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed it. The porcelain cracked and blackened, the silk dress turning to ash. But as the flames died down, she heard the whisper one last time. "You can't escape me, Eleanor. I'll always be with you." The next morning, Eleanor woke up to find the doll sitting on her bedside table, its glassy eyes staring at her, its lips curled into that faint, knowing smile. She screamed, but no sound came out. The doll whispered again, its voice soft and mocking. "You belong to me now." Eleanor tried to leave the house, but the doors were locked. The windows wouldn't open. The doll's whispers filled the air, drowning out her thoughts. She collapsed to the floor, her hands over her ears, but the whispers only grew louder. Days turned into weeks, and Eleanor became a prisoner in her own home. The doll never left her side, its whispers a constant reminder of her sins. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping. Her reflection in the mirror became a stranger, her eyes hollow and haunted. One night, as the whispers reached a crescendo, Eleanor made a decision. She took the doll in her hands and climbed to the top of the stairs. With a cry of desperation, she hurled it down, watching as it shattered into 1,000 pieces. For a moment, there was silence. Then the whispers began again, louder and more menacing than ever. They came from all around her, from the walls, the floor, the air itself. Eleanor sank to her knees, her mind unraveling. The last thing she saw was the doll's face, its shattered pieces reassembling themselves, its lips curling into that faint, knowing smile. When the authorities found Eleanor's body weeks later, they assumed she had died of natural causes. The house was empty, save for a single doll sitting on the mantelpiece, its glassy eyes staring straight ahead, its lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. And if you listen closely, they say, you can still hear the whispers. In the heart of the ancient city of Varenwood, where cobblestone streets wound like serpents through a labyrinth of Gothic spires and shadowed alleyways, there lived a violinist named Alara Voss. Her music was said to be unlike any other, a haunting, ethereal sound that seemed to transcend the boundaries of the mortal world. It was whispered among the townsfolk that her melodies could summon spirits, drawing them from the veil between life and death to dance in the moonlight. But Alara herself never spoke of such things. She played her violin in the town square every evening, her eyes closed, her soul pouring into the strings, as if she were communing with something or someone beyond the reach of the living. Alara had come to Varenwood 5 years ago, a mysterious figure with no past and no family. She carried only her violin, an antique instrument with a deep, rich tone, and a body carved with intricate runes that no one could decipher. The townsfolk were wary of her at first, but her music quickly won them over. It was said that her playing could soothe the most troubled heart, bring tears to the eyes of the stoic, and even heal the sick. But there were darker rumors too, rumors of strange occurrences that followed her performances. Flickering lanterns, cold drafts in warm rooms, and the faint sound of whispers when no one was around. Alara herself was an enigma. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her words were cryptic, as if she carried a weight too heavy to share. She lived in a small, crumbling cottage on the edge of the forest, far from the bustle of the town. The cottage was surrounded by an overgrown garden, its iron gate rusted and creaking in the wind. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves filled with strange artifacts, ancient books, jars of dried herbs, and shards of glass that seemed to catch the light in unnatural ways. But the most striking feature of the cottage was the portrait that hung above the fireplace, a painting of a man with piercing blue eyes and a sorrowful expression. No one knew who he was, but Alara would often stare at the portrait for hours, her fingers absently tracing the strings of her violin. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear, Alara took her usual place in the town square. The air was thick with the scent of blooming night flowers, and the crowd that gathered to hear her play was larger than usual. She closed her eyes, lifted her bow, and began to play. The melody that flowed from her violin was unlike anything the townsfolk had ever heard. It was a song of longing and loss, of love and betrayal, of life and death. The notes seemed to hang in the air, shimmering like ghosts, and as the music swelled, a strange thing happened. The lanterns that lined the square flickered and dimmed, and a cold wind swept through the crowd, sending shivers down their spines. The air grew heavy, and the shadows seemed to deepen, as if the night itself were alive. And then they appeared. At first, they were just faint outlines, shimmering like heat waves in the distance. But as Alara's music grew more intense, the outlines became clearer, taking on the shapes of people, men, women, and children, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. They moved in time with the music, their forms flickering like candle flames, their feet barely touching the ground. The townsfolk gasped and stepped back, their eyes wide with fear and wonder. But Alara played on, her eyes still closed, her face a mask of concentration. The spirits danced around her, their movements graceful and fluid, as if they were caught in a trance. Some of them reached out to the living, their translucent hands brushing against cheeks and shoulders, sending chills through those they touched. Others simply watched, their expressions a mixture of sadness and longing. And then, as the final note of the song faded into the night, the spirits began to dissolve, their forms breaking apart like smoke in the wind until they were gone. The square was silent, the crowd too stunned to speak. Alara lowered her violin and opened her eyes, her face pale and drawn. She looked out at the crowd, her gaze distant, as if she were seeing something they couldn't. And then, without a word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the alleyways. The townsfolk whispered among themselves, their voices filled with awe and fear. Some claimed that Alara was a witch, that her music was a form of dark magic. Others believed she was a conduit for the spirits, a bridge between the living and the dead. But no one dared to ask her directly. They were too afraid of what she might say or what she might summon. That night, Alara returned to her cottage, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had done. She sat by the fireplace, staring at the portrait of the man with the piercing blue eyes, her fingers absently tracing the strings of her violin. She knew that the spirits she had summoned were not just random souls. They were the lost, the forgotten, the ones who had been wronged in life and could not find peace in death. And she knew that her music was the key to unlocking their stories, to giving them a voice. But there was one spirit she had been searching for, one soul that had eluded her for years. It was the spirit of the man in the portrait, her beloved Lucian. He had been taken from her long ago, his life cut short by a betrayal that had left her heartbroken and alone. She had spent years searching for a way to bring him back, to hear his voice one more time, to feel his touch. And now she was closer than ever. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Alara lifted her violin and began to play. The melody was soft and mournful, a song of love and loss, of hope and despair. The notes filled the room, wrapping around her like a shroud. And as the music grew more intense, the air grew colder, the shadows deeper. And then she felt it, a presence, faint but unmistakable. She opened her eyes and saw him standing there, his form shimmering like moonlight on water. It was Lucian, his blue eyes filled with sorrow, his hand reaching out to her. Alara's heart ached as she reached for him, her fingers brushing against his, but they passed through him like smoke. "Lucian," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I've missed you so much." He smiled a sad, gentle smile and spoke, his voice a faint echo. "Alara, my love, you must let me go. I cannot stay." Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head. "No, I can't. I can't lose you again." "You must," he said, his voice growing fainter. "My time here is over, but yours is not. Live, Alara. Live for both of us." And then he was gone, his form dissolving into the air, leaving her alone once more. Alara sat in silence, her heart heavy with grief and relief. She knew that Lucian was right, that she had to let him go, to move on with her life. But she also knew that her music would always be a bridge to the other side, a way to honor the lost and the forgotten. From that night on, Ilara's music changed. It was still haunting, still beautiful, but there was a new lightness to it, a sense of hope and healing. She continued to play in the town square, and though the spirits still came, they were no longer restless or sorrowful. They danced in the moonlight, their forms shimmering like stars. When the music ended, they faded away, their souls at peace. And Ilara, though she still carried the weight of her past, found a new purpose in her music, a way to bring light to the darkness, to heal the wounds of the living and the dead alike. She became a legend in Varenwood, the violinist whose music could summon spirits. But she was more than that. She was a healer, a guide, a bridge between worlds. And though she never spoke of Lucian again, she knew that he was always with her, in every note she played, in every melody that flowed from her heart. And in that, she found peace.